Johnny, I want you to obey, and I want you to obey
now.
Excuse me. That's a bit harsh, isn't it?
So what do you think? Was that parent too harsh? Let's find out. Hi, Christy here with Moms Find Truth. And let me clarify immediately that yes, I do believe the look and tone that the mother had in the first example was too harsh. But let's get down to the message the mother was presenting, because that is what is often in question as being too harsh. The topic of today is immediate obedience, which is essentially referring to the concept that once someone in authority has asked or told you to do something, you need to not only do it, but you need to do it now. That leaves no wiggle room for, I'll get to it later, Mom, or the parent counting to 5. If you don't do it by the time I count to 5, then XYZ consequence or repercussion. If the child heard and understood the request or command, then the parent should not be needing to ask them again and again. The obedience should come now. Immediately. Immediate obedience. A common objection given to demanding immediate obedience from your children is the idea that, depending on the age of your children, that they're not old enough. Now, again, a prerequisite for immediate obedience is that they need to have heard you and also understand you. So we're not talking about a 6-month-old here, because they can't understand. So once your child is old enough to understand what is being asked of them, then they are old enough to decide when they're going to do it. And that is the main issue here, is that they are deciding when they're going to do it. They are old enough and making that call. The only question is, are they learning the habit of obeying you now, or are they learning the habit of obeying you later, or maybe even not at all? Either way, if they're comprehending that you are asking something of them or commanding something of them, the timing in which they respond is still their choice, and it is still developing either a good habit or a bad one. So really, I would say the accurate statement would be, they are too old for you to wait any longer. Another objection that I often hear is that the child often needs convincing or bargaining or talking into before they will agree to do what's been asked of them. Basically, you're just having to convince them to obey you. And often that is coming from a home that does not believe in punishments. Perhaps some natural consequences, but usually punishment is considered a negative term in a home that is supporting that idea. Why do I say that? Because if the child was recognizing that disobedience equals punishment, they often don't really need convincing in order to obey, because the punishment speaks for itself. Now, in that same vein, the same mothers that often bring that objection are often of the mindset that God is a loving God, and we in our parenting style should be emulating that love of God. And I get that, and I 150% agree with that. But one, as we read through Scripture, we can very quickly and easily see that God has a very just and, I would even say, harsh side as well. I'm not going to sit here and list off some of the brutal consequences that are listed in His Word coming directly from God. You can very easily find those. But also, I think we give too little credit to the idea that punishment and bringing about consequences in our children's lives is very often the exact demonstration of love that they truly need. Again, I've spoken of this in previous videos, but there are many ideas presented in today's society as loving or accepting or being very tolerant of those around you. But yet, if your child gets pulled into those ways of thinking that are very much against what God lays out in His Word, and you are not stepping in and giving consequence and severe motivation to pull away from those ways of thinking, then they're going to keep cruising on that path until God puts down the ultimate punishment, the natural consequence for their sin, and they spend an eternity in hell. So again, the consequences that we can give to them now, when they are doing wrong, when they are needing to learn to not only respect our authority, but God's authority, is truly one of the most loving things we as parents can do. So if your child is needing to be convinced to obey mommy and daddy, how do you expect them to respond to God when they become adults? And when their eternity is on the line? They need to learn that respect and that obedience, that immediate obedience now. And then the last big objection that I get is just this idea that immediate obedience is just completely unnecessary. It's kind of like, maybe some of the school classes that you're like, if I'm not actually going to become a teacher on this subject, when am I ever going to use this information? And a lot of parents perceive the idea of immediate obedience as kind of like a power trip for a parent, and kind of saying, I'm your parent, I'm your authority, I have power over you. You'll not only do what I want, you'll do it now. But when we really think about the application, we can see that idea really falls apart. Because if you think about a boss telling an employee what they need to do, a police officer telling someone who they've pulled over, or a criminal what needs to be done, a judge making a call, any sort of authority figure that's going to cross your child's path is not going to be great with the idea of your child responding, you know what? I'll do what you say when I feel like it. And again, I cannot reinforce this enough. Once God has told your child that they need to do something, telling God I'll get to it when I feel like it should not be an option on the table. But if we do not teach them immediate obedience now, it is not only going to be an option on the table, it is going to be an ingrained habit in their life. Now, I'll get more into this in a minute, but as you are teaching your children the idea of obedience, before you set your expectation at immediate obedience, you need to communicate and teach your children what obedience truly is, what mommy and daddy are expecting of them, and then what ramifications are to follow if they do not obey mommy and daddy. So first, before you can communicate that to your child, you have to decide between you and your husband what the definition of obedience is in your home. I'm going to share with you the definition in our home, and a definition that I would strongly advise you to consider applying to yours. And I'll give you an example of why. So the definition we have in our home for obedience is to obey now, and to obey with joy. So if you disobey, or you obey later, or you obey in a rude or grumpy fashion, you are disobeying. It's all one and the same. You are not obeying mommy and daddy. And again, often accused of being harsh on this point, but think about it. If your child is grown up, is driving down the road, and is speeding, and the police pull up behind him or her and turn on the sirens and the lights, and your child just doesn't pull over, so just disobeys what the police is saying he needs to do, that will be problematic, will it not? Okay, so that's number one. But then what if your child does pull over the police officer comes up to the window and says, I need your driver's license and registration. And then your child says, I'm on the phone right now, so I'll get to you when I'm done. Well, that's not going to go great either. And that's number 2. Or what if police turns on the lights, child pulls over, police comes up to the window and says, I need your driver's license and registration. And the child says, oh, all right, I'll get them for you, and chucks them at the police officer because they're so ticked. That's not going to go great either. And that would be number 3. You see, and you can take that same scenario and apply it to a boss at work, or apply it to Jesus. No matter what authority your child as an adult responds to, if they are not doing what the authority is telling them to, or they are doing it later whenever they feel like it, or they are doing it with a massive amount of attitude directed at the authority, it's not going to be okay. But that, again, that is exactly what we're setting them up for in life if we're not teaching them something different now. If we're telling them they need to obey, but sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they do, but just later. Or sometimes they do with a lot of attitude. And we're not creating consequences for that. We're basically communicating to them, I might not like what you're doing, but you can do it. There's nothing standing in your way from doing that. And they're just going to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And again, it's just going to be the way they respond to authority. And later on down the line, you know what? They might respond better because a police officer can put them in jail. He can have consequences. Or the boss might fire them. More consequences. But I'm telling you, a lot of the consequences that will come from behaving that way with Jesus are a lot further down the line. Aren't necessarily immediate, and can be very easy to ignore and not attach to our behavior. So honestly, if I do not teach my children the correct and true way to respect and respond to authority, my biggest fear is not for their future job or even their future criminal record. It is for their future eternity with Christ and the relationship that they have with Him from the moment they get saved on. That is what I'm needing to teach them now. So as kind of icing on the cake, picture a future where your child does immediately obey. They obey now, and they obey with joy. No more bargaining and threatening or frustration building up, trying to figure out how to get through to them. No more having to argue and convince your child that you know what you're talking about and they need to do what you say. I don't believe that these should be the ultimate reason that we make these changes. But we all know how much easier life would be if all of these things I just listed were not a part of it. So how do we get there? How do we get to the point of our children knowing how to and choosing to immediately obey? First is setting yourself up, I would say. So that has multiple levels to it. I'd say first would be define obedience in your family. If not my definition, find your own. That again, your test should be if this is how my child was responding to Christ. Would Christ consider this obedience? And if the answer is yes, then there you go. And then secondly, set up reminders for yourself, because as much as this is going to be a habit for your child to learn, in those moments when they've been told to do something, they don't like it, they need to develop a new habit of how to respond. Well, you need to develop a new habit in those moments as well. We're not bargaining anymore. We're not threatening anymore. We're not begging or trying to convince. we are raising our expectations to the point of immediate obedience. And if that immediate obedience is not there, we need to move into the consequence category. Because every time they do not immediately obey and we do not move into consequence category, we are sending the message to them that this is an okay way to respond to authority. This is an okay way to respond to Christ. Step number 2 is to communicate. So once you are set up, that you feel like you have set up the reminders and such that you can commit to consistency in this area, and once you and your husband have agreed on a definition of obedience that you as a unit will be enforcing in your home, it is time to communicate the new expectations to your children. And I would even say, depending on the age of your child, there might be a transition period. Like, for instance, with my 4-year-old, he knows the definition of obedience. And he's moved out of the transition period at this point, but I would say more when he was in the 3-year-old range. Often, if he was not obeying, or he was acknowledging that I had asked him to do something and communicating he would do it, he would say, but wait until I'm done with this, or whatever he was delaying it for. Or he would be obeying but grumpy. Instead of immediately jumping into consequences, I would have him stop in his tracks, look at me, and say, you need to obey, you need to, and then I would stop and I'd let him fill in the gaps. Obey now and obey with joy. And I'd say, Mommy told you to do XYZ. I told you to do it now. And I need you to do it with joy. Show me joy. And he'd smile. And then I'd say, go obey. And it was still communicating, this is the standard. This path you were about to go on of not obeying, or obeying later, or obeying grumpy, we're stopping that. You're stopping in your tracks right there. We're going down this path. We're obeying. And if there was any pushback at that point, then we can move into consequences. But when they're that young, I just would rather err on the side of, I want to make sure that you're getting this, that you really understand what I'm talking about, and you're not just going to get confused when we jump into the consequence category. And then the next step, which depending on the age of your child, can be one of the toughest, especially if you're having to backtrack a little bit. Maybe there's some habits that are needing to be broken and reestablished. Step number 3 is taking the time to teach your children true respect for their authority, which honestly, based on peer examples nowadays, is getting harder and harder to teach our kids because it's not what is generally accepted as the norm. And I would love to jump into the how-tos in teaching your child respect for authority right here, right now. But that is a little bit deeper of a topic. And so what I would like to direct you to is linked below. And it is the Overwhelmed Mommy Club. It is a 10-module course that I've just taken everything that I have and I've put it into this course. And one of the first modules is teaching you how to teach your children respect for authority, obedience, and continuing to stress the building of their relationship and the bonding with your child as equally, if not more, valuable lesson than the authority side of parenting. And then from there, I build to how to teach everyone in your home to get a good night's sleep, how to declutter your home and organize it, how to automate all of the tasks in your home, and then ultimately how to help your children who now respect your authority and help them become part of the running and the team of your home so that you can all be working on this together. And all of that for $7 a month. And with that, I also offer a members only Facebook group so that any questions or concerns or needs for encouragement can be posted there. And then I do a once a month Q&A and deep dive training through a podcast that you will have access to as well. Again, all of that for $7 a month. Now, once you've clicked on that link, signed up for the club, come back and watch the video that should be popping up on the screen as to why yelling at your kids or raising your voice at your kids simply isn't working and what to do about that. And remember, I'm always here if you need me. Bye.